The Canadian economy is changing forever, and it's changing right now. All Canadians need to understand this, but Canadian investors need to understand this even more. Today, we're talking about something that I've started calling the infrastructure supercycle. The idea is that right now, thanks to a million little things and a couple really big ones, we are in a position where Canada's leaders, both left and right, have decided it's time to invest in infrastructure in this country. And they are pivoting towards natural resources and getting Canadian natural resources to market. As an investor, this presents massive opportunities to make a huge amount of money. And as a Canadian, it means there's going to be a huge shift to our economy that we need to understand. Today, I want to talk about both sides of the political spectrum to help understand the coming infrastructure supercycle. We're going to talk about the specific projects that are likely to get done. We're going to talk about some of the things that I think are the most interesting. And we're going to talk, of course, about some of the opportunities that Canadian investors have to make a huge amount of money while investing in our own country and supporting projects that will improve our future. If you're interested in that, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel. It makes a huge difference. Doesn't cost anything. We're going to start on the screen right here beside me with the current Prime Minister of Canada and one of the two frontrunners to be the Prime Minister for the next 5 years, Mr. Mark Carney. And this is his sort of plan talking about building the strong Canadian economy. Now, I'm not going to make you read through all of the things, but there's a couple really interesting elements in here. Specifically, the elements where he talks about building a national trade and economic corridor. Now, I've talked about this a couple times on the channel, but there's a couple interesting elements in here. He talks about building a first mile fund. So building transportation networks to connect energy extraction sites to rail lines and roads. So that is the sort of company specific small scale infrastructure that you get on site where they're doing any of this sort of resource extraction. Obviously here he's talking about energy. So we're talking about oil sands potentially. We're talking about shale, right? The Montney Basin area. And he's talking about providing capital to finance these key projects across the country. He's also saying the government of Canada will expedite project construction and create more integrated and accessible Canadian economy. So the government itself will step up and say, hey, okay, maybe this isn't viable because it's really hard to get this deposit to this pipeline. We'll fix that for you. Maybe this specific area isn't viable to drill because it has this infrastructure challenge. We'll fix that for you. That could be huge for bridging the gap between some of these sites that maybe have been passed around from exploration company to development company, but hasn't actually found real value yet, right? If you can get public money to do some of the infrastructure work, that could be huge. One window approval process, streamlining approvals for large scale national interest infrastructure projects. This new measure will create clear, predictable, and efficient review processes with high standards for safety, environmental protection, and Indigenous consultation. And the biggest thing, reduce uncertainty for investors. Just the other day, I made a video talking about the political de-risking for major investors. This is a specific policy change that would do a similar thing. So he's looking to make it easier to invest in these big projects by making the federal approval process much easier. He's also talked about maybe making it so that it's just one approval process. All of this would save millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars for a lot of these projects and incentivize could be hundreds of billions of dollars of investment that otherwise is too afraid of the potential for governments to crack down. He also talks about investing in Cedar LNG. I'm obviously pretty big in favor. I've talked about Pembina on the channel. I've talked about all our LNG potentials on the channel. And that's something that I've been really bullish on. I think that's going to change the economy. But seeing investment go towards that from the federal government is huge because, again, it does benefit a lot of different companies if that project is built and quickly. And then finally, a really big, interesting project here, investment in the Hudson's Bay Railway and the Port of Churchill in Manitoba, which will expand and open new transportation corridors, bolster economic growth and reconciliation in the Canadian Arctic and North, help get Canadian products to global markets. I'm really interested to see what that plan might materialize as, because obviously that could be a deep water port with access to the world's oceans that doesn't have to go all the way to the East Coast. Are we thinking pipeline? Are we thinking LNG? That could be huge, right? So obviously there's lots of minerals there, but if you can connect other infrastructure to that, that could be massive. Game changer for the Canadian economy. We'll look at one more thing about Carney. This is straight from the CBC. This is again talking about his interest in infrastructure and natural resources. Specifically here, he's shifting away from the previous regime's emission cap. And I mean, obviously, this is an Edmonton-based reporter. It's going to be a little bit biased, right? So am I. I'm also Alberta-based. So important to recognize that if you don't watch the channel regularly. But lots of things in here. He's talking about how he wants to be more competitive working with the industry. Obviously, he talked a little bit about the potential for a cap, right? It's been up in the news. A lot of people out here in Alberta, I'll say, were really, really angry about the cap when it first came on. They said it was a production cap. Obviously, the federal government argued, oh, no, it's just an emissions cap. And the prime minister and the premier probably had a fiery argument about that, I'm sure. A frank discussion. I see that right there as how Smith described it. Interesting. All right, but lots and lots of other stuff to talk about there. But the big one here. He says, and I quote, "The commitment is to deliver projects like those that we agreed are national priorities. It's about getting, yes, pipelines built across the country so we can displace imports of foreign oil." So he's saying here, even in these moments where people are challenging him, pushing back on him, trying to push him into a corner, he says, no, this is my position. I support building pipelines. I think this is important. That's huge. That is not something you would have seen 5-10 years ago. And so it opens the door for a lot of investment, both public and private. Now, obviously, Carney is the current prime minister, but since we are in the middle of an election, it's only fair that I talk about the opposition. Right now, the election is maybe a couple points in favor of the Liberals, but things have shifted so fast in the last couple of months. If we don't pay attention to what the Conservatives want to do, we could be blindsided. As an investor, you never want to be unaware of a potential future. And as a Canadian, you probably also want to know this. So if I skip over here, this is straight from the Conservative Party of Canada. And this is Pierre Poilievre's plan. And he's talking about Canada shovel-ready zones. And you know what? Obviously, the language is going to be very political. But let me try and deconstruct, maybe the word decipher some of this stuff. Right? So they're talking about deciding on areas where different regulations maybe don't apply, right? So he says here in this little 4-step process, identify a location that makes sense for power station, LNG, pipeline, or another major project. Sick. Make sure it's safe for Canadians and the environment. Okay, sick. Work with other levels of government to lock down zoning and permits in advance of construction. Offer pre-permitting before even getting an application so permits can be published online with a checklist that businesses would have to complete in order to protect nature and people. So basically, he's saying, we're going to try and fast track the process. We're going to try and sort of let them start work and then finish the process. But we're not going to, we're still going to keep it, and I quote, safe for Canadians and the environment. Obviously, that is in favor of building more pipelines specifically. But also, look at what he mentions. LNG plants by name. At power stations, are we thinking maybe nuclear or another major project? I think it's really interesting that he put power stations on there. I feel like we've been so focused on resources, we're failing to mention some of that. We could see SMRs, right? That could be huge for some of our resource industries. He mentions a whole bunch of other stuff in here, right? He says it takes 17 years to build a mine in Canada. It's so slow. It costs a huge amount of money. All these projects are canceled. And he says that they're going to unleash billions of dollars in power plants, nuclear energy, mines, pipelines, data centers, and much more. And again, the $100 billion here is something I've been talking about. It's not Canadian taxpayer dollars. You don't have to worry like, oh my God, they're going to spend all of my money that I pay in taxes. Instead, what they're doing is they are incentivizing private sector investment. And a lot of it's going to be foreign investment. That just by the simple math, there's going to be a lot of money coming in from global markets that are going to take the best opportunity they can see. And both of these leaders are changing policy because that hasn't been happening as much. Let me skip to the next one here. A specific project proposal, kind of similar, right? Carney talked about Churchill. Carney talked about Cedar LNG. Poilievre's been talking about mining in the Ring of Fire. The Ring of Fire area is in Northern Ontario. We talked about this when we've talked about companies like Agnico Eagle or Barrick Gold, where this area has a huge amount of deposits, but it is pretty rural, right? It's pretty sparse. It's a long ways from a lot of our major centers. It's a very long way from the ocean. And so it is difficult for a lot of these resources to get to market efficiently. Now, not as huge a deal if you're Agnico Eagle and you're mainly a gold miner, but if you're mining critical minerals, if you're mining copper and you got to compete with like major worldwide competitors, and these commodities have not seen massive price increases, Every penny you can save on things like infrastructure, transportation, permitting is huge. He talks about he's going to commit $1 billion to building roads, so getting those resources to market. They talk about all sorts of things. He talks about how it's going to be life-changing money. It's a way to lessen Canada's reliance on on China, pardon me, for critical minerals. And he talks about some of the best projects in the area. And it's something that the Premier of Ontario has been looking forward to. And it is a challenging area. I feel like that would be a challenging task, but I think it's really interesting. In that case, he's talking about specific investments into the mining sector. Now, I'm going to jump to the next page, but before I do that, I just want to point out two different ideas here, right? Two different political parties. But the one thing that we as Canadians and we as Canadian investors should look at, they agree more or less, right? As much as they want to call each other names and downplay each other, they agree that Canada's economy needs to be focused on natural resources. This is massive because for the last 10 years, we have seen the government desperately try to pull Canada's economy away from natural resources. Focus on technology, focus on services, focus on real estate even. And while that's been successful in some areas for some people, both of these leaders are saying, hey, right now, Canada needs all the strength it can get. And the biggest strength is these natural resources. And unlocking them is our priority. It's been a major topic of conversation. It's been the topic on the economy. I think it's really interesting. I think it's really major for investors because we have the potential to front run some of this. And I've talked about some companies. We're going to talk about one in a moment. But as a Canadian, it's a shift in the way the country is going. Instead of pushing the country away from natural resources, we're pivoting back towards them. And we're going to spend a huge amount of money creating better opportunities in that sector. Now, this can impact lots of people in negative ways, right? We've seen, I live in Alberta. We saw a lot of community backlash for some of the most recent mines opened up on the east face of the Rockies. Somebody who loves to spend time in the Rockies. I mean, I named my channel after the larch trees, right? It's sad to see some of these projects disturb some of our beautiful areas, but obviously politicians now are aligned. These projects need to be done. And so it's really interesting. And if you're an investor like me, you're probably looking for specific companies and how they're going to react to this stuff, how they're going to profit from this, who's going to win. And one of the companies I think is a big winner is CNQ. And so I'm going to show them something they've said. And they've sent this to all sorts of folks. If I scroll up, they sent it to the leaders of all of the major parties. And it's an open letter. It talks about how Canadian energy can help strengthen Canada's economic sovereignty, right? He says there's increasing public support to urgently grow our energy sector. He talks about expanding LNG terminals, critically important global commodities. He says they're responsible for the majority of oil and gas production and pipelines in the country. They want to share their perspective. All sorts of interesting things in here, but the real stuff, I want to jump down to their dot points, right? That they think this is what needs to happen. Simplify regulation, commit to firm deadlines, grow production, attract investment, and incentivize Indigenous co-investment opportunities. So they say, hey, all of these things that you're doing basically are what we need. And they say that if this stuff happens, and by sort of making these projects national interest and by setting aside specific rules for them and prioritizing them and trying to cut through some of the red tape, it's going to be huge for them and that they're in a good position to expand. And you got to think, if you were inside one of these companies and you could see the way the wind's going, you would be saying the same thing, right? I'm sure there's lots of others from other companies. These guys are the scale player, which is why I wanted to talk about them. But a lot of these companies see what's happening and they're going to put themselves in a position to win. There's huge amounts of American money that needs somewhere to go, with shale looking like it's at the end of its growth phase. There's a huge amount of Canadian money that's been scared to invest in this industry because the government hasn't been on side. And there's a bunch of foreign money that is just not willing to invest in an area they think is going to be negatively impacted by politics. With politics all aligned with this massive infrastructure supercycle looking like it's going to make Canadian natural resources incredibly profitable in the not so distant future, I think as an investor and as a Canadian, we should be paying attention. So as an investor, I recommend read up on some of these companies, decide which ones you like, Decide what areas you want to invest in. Are you a gold mine guy, critical minerals guy? Are you into the energy space, right? And what about those companies makes you think they're a good opportunity? And you know what? When you do that, please let me know in the comments down below. I love talking about this stuff here on the channel. It's a major passion of mine, and it just makes a huge difference. So yeah, let me know, what companies are you looking at? Who do you think is going to benefit from this massive investment super cycle? How do you see the Canadian economy changing in the next 10 years? And I hope I see you in the next one.